Questions? Yes, please, and please tell us who you are. So we can.
Sorry, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
I'm previously people, but I was wondering, to what extent was the disdain of this customary law in Africa a result of just the British imperial superiority complex, or was there also just the fact that it was customary law itself that was so different from the formal jurisprudence mentality of countries such as Britain? If that makes sense, that I think the customary law was the mode of expressing the law was something that they disagreed with generally.
Well, thank you for your question. It's of course very difficult to trace. When I say sources, I mostly mean diplomatic dispatches. So of course, they just give one side of the story, so it's very difficult to trace the origins of a sentiment such as disdain or condescension. My personal, and this is something that is very hard to check empirically if it's not expressly written in the sources. But I think, and this is just purely an expression of my opinion, is that I think it had more to do with the discourse of civilization, which is very much connected with also the advent of the abolition of the slave trade, because it was very difficult for the British to abolish the slave trade, not just among European powers, but also in Africa itself, because it was so incredibly profitable for them. And for example, an empire like that of the Ashanti, it existed on the slave trade. So, I mean, the fact that they couldn't abolish it through the means of treaties was, for them, a proof of the barbarity or barbarism, if you like, of these African societies. And that was very much connected with this idea of, we don't want to adhere to their customs because, well, obviously they must be barbarians if they just don't abolish the slave trade, which is so clearly evil and wrong. I don't think it has anything to do with the fact that it was custom as such, as in unwritten rules which were not formalized, because it was such a long established tradition for the British as well to just go along with African custom. It was the way things had been handled for centuries, ever since the British had been present on the west coast of Africa, basically. So I think it has more to do with this discourse of civilization, but again, it's just my opinion.
Further questions? Yes, please.
Well, thanks so much. One question for
Can you
Professor
raise
Biladi.
your voice?
Yes, for a very engrossing presentation. But brief question about this minority right issue. You very compellingly showed that these lawyers present in the yearbook also agreed that minority protection had failed previously. I was just wondering, was there any idea how one would tackle the question of non-Jewish minorities within the new Israeli state in this period, judging from the experience one had oneself? Just a not provocative, but it's just a question.
Interesting. In a sense, what I did here in this project, in some related projects, I looked at the development of thought of certain key individuals like Jacob Robinson, Shafer Rosen. I didn't look at internal policies. Having said that, in the diplomatic source materials, I really found surprising that there was very little connect between this way in which the minority system, human rights, in those early days were conceived, and the conflict. The conflict had a very small part in determining Israel's international outlook in those years when it comes to rights, minorities, individual rights, and so forth. So I hope this is an answer. Very little connect, surprisingly.
Yeah.
You would like to pose a question? Yes.
I have a question for Omer. Does the attention of the League of Nations for these diseases, does it also have anything to do with the outbreak of the Spanish influenza?
Well, that's interesting. Spanish influenza is I think it's a bit prior to the League of Nations. I think it's in the early, I'm not an expert, but I think it's in the early, it's in the first half. I mean, it's in 1913 or 1914.
Yeah.
So I think it's right. But the League is just, I mean, the establishment is the League is no prior to September, to the summer of 1919, and it's very intense years are in the 20s, during the 20s and the 30s. Until now I haven't seen any kind of indication that they are referring to treat or to handle or to fight against the spread of the Spanish flu. But we can see perhaps that's a good question or that's a good comment, because maybe the trauma of this experience also influenced their intense interest in fighting this. But what's interesting about, because they do talk about Europe, but it's always, I mean, the circles are always expanding, because in the 20s, at least what I've found until now. So in the 20s they talk much of the discussion, or more the major part of the discussion is dealing with the problem in the Ukraine. For example, they're talking especially about the fears that diseases are going to spread to the west from the Ukraine and also from Poland, but especially from the Ukraine and this or the western part of what to become the Soviet Union. That's after the Communist Revolution. And during the 20s, we can see the circles are becoming more and more small. And then they are also related to the Balkans, and of course, because there are cases, like there are really cases or problems of diseases that come from the Balkans and from the Middle East, for example. But in the late 20s, we can see that they are sending special delegations also to the Far East, because they're afraid that diseases are going to come from and spread from harbors and ports that have economic relations with Europe. So they're sending a lot of experts to deal with harbors or ports in China and in other parts of Southeast Asia. So it's very interesting to see how the fear of disease there is always some kind of a relative east in a way, which is the source of diseases in many ways. And it's not patronizing about it, but they do try to solve these problems, but the issues are always related, in most cases they are related to the East. And that's also interesting, because in the rural hygiene conference held in Bandung, in Java, for example, so also there's a delegation comes from India, and they're saying that the Chinese are afraid that diseases are going to come and threaten them from China. So it seems that very interesting to know that or to see that each and every country has its own relatively east or problem area around.
Still, thank you. This was very interesting, but it does sound to me, like you said several times, that the focus of the League is defending Europe ultimately, which is very interesting given the period, because we know of growing restrictions on immigration to Europe and to the United States and to other, Canada, Australia. So I wonder if there's a connect between restriction of immigration policies and the movement of persons as dealt with by the League and the sanitary health/environment issues. And if there is, I want to know.
I have to think about it, because it's an excellent question. Inga, also thanks a lot. I have to think about it. I'm not so sure. I still haven't seen, for my own, maybe I'm a mistake, but I haven't seen an interaction like when they discuss directly with the problem or transportation. I mean, the problems of, but they do. I mean, and I think that refers to your question. They do talk a lot about refugees, because I mean, except as I mentioned, there were three main goals. There was global security and some kind of defining the structure of sovereign state in international arena and global security. And the other humanitarian problems that they were mentioning in the statutes of the League of Nations on the Common, for example. So besides diseases and plagues, they were dealing a lot with refugees. So there was also one of the main problems they were dealing, especially in the early 20s, and problems in Greece and the problems in the Ukraine and others. So it's important to think, that's an interesting idea to think about the connection between plagues and refugees.
Question to Constance about medicine. I'm struggling to think about ransom being a legal institution, to legalizing it by way of insuring against it. And I wonder whether it happens, whether it makes it more likely for an insured person to be kidnapped, because the kidnappers will know that they have a better chance that they will receive the money. And I would like to ask the other question, which is motivated by the country where we are now, that there is a social responsibility to pay the ransom or try to rescue the person who fell in captivity. Is there such an institution, either written or unwritten, whether there is a social responsibility for the community to pay the ransom price or try to rescue the person who fell into captivity?
Thanks for your two questions. Maybe the second one first. In fact, in the doctrinal sources, the authors just don't precise if some people have a particular responsibility to pay the ransom. But in fact, in France, there are a lot of religious communities who are not delegated, but their major activity is to repurchase the captives. But it's not compulsory. It just when you study the sources, you can see that the major activity was to repay, but it's not connected to any legal status. It's just in the fact. But I think there are two religious orders, the Order of Mercy and another one who are specialized, and also they have to organize not only the payment of the ransom, but also they go in foreign countries to negotiate with people, so it's not only a legal activity about ransom, it's also material activity. Can you just repeat your first question?
Does the fact of being insured raises the possibility of being kidnapped?
In fact, it's a very interesting question, because nowadays, currently, there are some ransom insurances, and one of the major problem, if for example you have a ransom insurance and you're captured, for example by our dear organizing committee, for example, you are insured, your insurer will not negotiate directly with the organizing committee, because if he does this, they will know that you have an insurance. They just let the people negotiate the price of the ransom, because one of the major problems is not to spread the idea that a lot of people have ransom insurances, because it can just be an incitation to capture people and to ransom them. But for example, at the 16th century, at the time of my research, I can't affirm that with ransom insurance there is a change. I don't know if with this legal introduction of ransom insurances there is more paid ransom or not. So, and the doctrinal sources, the authors just don't develop this problem. It's a very current issue, and for them, it's maybe it's very strange, but it's that just they don't focus on this problem.
Yeah, question for Inga. So you mentioned how the British would try to get out of the treaties by saying they didn't ratify them. I was wondering if you've come across British courts or other legal officials giving legal weight to these treaties. Thinking a bit anachronistically, there's a big Privy Council case in the 1920s, which, by the way, you should all go read about downstairs, in which the Privy Council says that the British colonial officials are not bound by a treaty that the British government has signed, even though no one denies the validity of the treaty, but it just doesn't apply legally to the British officials. They can ignore it. So I'm wondering if those kind of issues came up in courts or in legal opinions of legal advisors or anything that appears to have.
Yeah. And that means that you were lucky enough to have a treaty that was actually adjudicated upon by the Privy Council, which unfortunately I haven't found yet. Most of the treaties in those cases of non-ratification do date from the period prior to the Scramble for Africa, exactly because there was no official policy of territorial acquisition. I haven't found any court cases related to them, but I have found a lot of parliamentary debates. For example, there was a big parliamentary committee in 1865. Because kind of imperial policy in Britain shifted between periods of jingoism, so real enthusiasm for imperialism, and then just the complete opposite. And 1865 is one of those periods that had a low point for British imperial policy. And during that committee, you do see a lot of references to a couple of these treaties, and technically that area that we have acquired there in Sierra Leone is not really ours. But, it's been there now for, let's say, 50 years, so let's just keep it. That's the most I've found in terms of official documents that actually admit that there hasn't been an official territorial acquisition. And, of course, by the time the Scramble for Africa has begun, most of these areas had become official crown colonies or protectorates, so...
We have a moment for just one last question.
So one quick, if I may, that was very interesting. I was wondering you were talking about, if I got it right, about the palaver.
Yeah.
But that's
I don't know exactly how it's
that's
pronounced
from.
myself.
So that's interesting because it seems to me as some sort of early, if we may, some kind of an early or semi-legal mechanism of solving problems. That's interesting. You're also focusing on that. On the decisions, for example, or the protocols, whether they had any such, for example. What was the legal routine of these institutions or semi-institutions, for example?
It depended from, African community to African community, and also from dispute to dispute. So you had different kinds of rituals. For example, I spoke of this taking of fetish. There's an example of...
there were no British involved in this?
Yes, there were.
Oh.
There were. So, for example, there was at a certain point there was actually a British embassy that had gone to Kumasi, which was the capital of the Ashanti state, and they were negotiating a treaty. And then, basically, the British delegation had to wait for a number of weeks, during which there were these feasts and exchange of gifts. Then they would go to the Ashanti king. He would then, threaten them a couple of times, displays of power, lots of displays of power. Then the British would retreat to their quarters. This whole process would start up again. So it could take a number of weeks, if not months. And then eventually the treaty would be negotiated and concluded, and then a herbal mixture was drunk, which was then the taking of the fetish. And this herbal mixture was a sacred kind of mixture that then bound the parties together. And in the perception of Ashanti, if you broke the sacred oath, you would die, actually.
And the British took part of this kind of...
Yes, they well, they didn't have a choice. The first, actually, this is quite a funny story. The first British embassy that came to Kumasi, which was headed by Thomas Bowditch, and he was so intimidated by the Ashanti that after the same day the treaty was concluded, he and his party, they fled Kumasi in the middle of the night because they were so afraid. But they were actually, Ashanti was a very, I mean, it was all display. They were actually, they had treaties were sacred to them, so they adhered to all of their treaty obligations, whereas the British, well, it's because the British didn't take the treaty seriously enough that the first Anglo-Ashanti War actually started.
So please let me dissolve.